Winter 2022. Eastern Ukraine lay smothered beneath a curtain of freezing fog so dense it blurred the world into shifting shadows. The air tasted like steel and smoke as a Russian artillery unit prepared for a night barrage along the forested outskirts of Donetsk. Engines rumbled low, breath steamed from chapped mouths, and the fog swallowed every sound faster than it could escape. Captain Anton Lebedev, 34 years old, disciplined, quiet, sharp as the ice forming on his gloves, stood rigid beside his mobile field console, coordinating the strike through short, clipped bursts of radio chatter. His men trusted him because he never hesitated, never panicked, never misplaced a detail. Tonight, wrapped in darkness and mist, he looked almost carved from the cold itself. "Battery 2, confirm elevation," he said into the handset. Static crackled back, followed by a muffled voice affirming the numbers. Anton nodded, marking a position on a damp, wrinkled map. Ukrainian forces were believed to be dug in beyond the tree line, and command wanted them pushed back under cover of night. The order was routine. The atmosphere was anything but. A gust of wind dragged the fog sideways, revealing the faint outline of cedar silhouettes rising like ghosts from the earth. The men checked their coordinates, adjusted their sights, and braced for recoil. "Fire," Anton commanded. The night erupted. A thunderous chain of blasts shook the ground as artillery shells tore into the dark. Light flashed through the fog like lightning trapped between the trees. Snowflakes, stirred by the shock waves, spiraled through the air in frantic little dances. One volley, then another. Precision, rhythm, a deadly heartbeat pulsing into the forest, then silence. The men waited for Anton's next command. But there was nothing, no voice, no instruction, not even static. "Captain Lebedev, confirm," a gunner called into his headset. Still nothing. A lieutenant waved a flashlight through the fog where Anton had been standing moments before. No silhouette, no footprints leading away. The map lay half buried in frost at the exact spot he'd last been seen. By the time the unit regrouped, nerves frayed and breath quickening with cold and unease, one truth settled over them, heavier than the winter air. Captain Anton Lebedev had vanished between one heartbeat and the next, swallowed whole by a night strike he had commanded, and no one had seen how. At first, the unit assumed Anton had simply moved position, stepped back behind a vehicle, crouched low to avoid the blast waves, anything that made sense in a world governed by logic and war. But seconds stretched into minutes, and the fog pressed closer around them like a living thing. The uneasy silence after the artillery strike felt wrong, too thick, too complete. "Spread out," Lieutenant Borodin ordered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Men fanned into the mist, boots sinking into frozen mud, flashlights cutting thin tunnels of light through the darkness. "Anton," someone called, the name swallowed instantly. There was no responding shout, no equipment rustling, no explosion debris, nothing. They swept the immediate area first, the command post markers, the firing line, the path between the supply trucks. The only tracks leading toward the tree line were the ones they themselves had made earlier that night. Lebedev's were gone, either erased or never extended beyond that single patch of earth. A gunner swore under his breath when the beam of his flashlight traced the ground near the ravine, footprints several sets, then abruptly nothing, as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. The ravine itself was shallow, muddy, with no signs of a fall, no drag marks, no broken branches, no disturbed snow, just emptiness. "Check for radio interference," Borodin said, though they all knew Anton wasn't the type to simply switch off his comms. They tuned their frequencies up and down, listening for even the faintest scratch of his voice. The fog gave them only hollow static. Some men whispered theories sniper shot, captured silently, wandered off, disoriented, but none of them fit. There was no blood, no shell crater, no Ukrainian units reported in the area. It was as if a man who had lived his entire life in precise, measured control had stepped into the dark and allowed it to erase him without leaving a trace. By dawn, the report was written with clinical detachment. Capt. A. Lebedev, missing in action. No further explanation, no details. Just a single line in a conflict drowning in lost names. But among the soldiers who'd watched him vanish into fog that hadn't yet lifted, a heavier truth lingered, one they didn't dare speak aloud. Anton hadn't just gone missing, he had disappeared. Anton Lebedev was never supposed to vanish. Not him. He wasn't one of the reckless ones, not the kind to break under pressure or lose his way in fog. He was the officer other soldiers looked to when things fell apart. Born into a military family in the Komi Republic, Anton had grown up with the smell of gun oil in the house and the sound of parade drills echoing through his childhood. His father was Spetsnaz, his grandfather an artillery commander in Afghanistan. Discipline ran in his blood like iron, but Anton wasn't just legacy, he was brilliance made quiet. Top of his class at the Frunze Military Academy, fluent in English and Chechen, with a talent for topography so precise that instructors used his mock campaigns as teaching tools. Syria had been his proving ground. By 30, he'd already earned 2 commendations for precision-targeted artillery strikes that spared civilian zones while crippling militant supply lines. His fellow officers joked he could read terrain like other men read newspapers. The joke stopped after Aleppo. He was decorated, respected, meticulous to the point of ritual. But outside the war rooms and artillery grids, there was something else. Anton loved the forest. Not just respected, it loved it. Before uniforms, before ranks, there were the pine woods of Komi, where he'd hunt elk with his grandfather in silence for hours. He knew how to listen, how to move without being seen, how to wait. Stillness is not the absence of movement, he once told a young conscript. It's the presence of patience. That's what made him dangerous. Not anger, not bravado, patience. He didn't speak unless it was necessary, didn't guess when he could calculate. In debriefings, his answers were short but precise, like he was filing truth into categories. Fellow officers called him the unbreakable one. He'd walk into unstable terrain with a map in one hand and a compass in the other and never come back confused. So when news spread that Captain Anton Lebedev had disappeared, no firefight, no capture, just gone, it didn't register at first. Some thought it was a joke. Others waited for the correction, but none came. A man built on precision had slipped through the cracks of his own calculations, and the army, which had once paraded him as the model of control, now had no explanation. Weeks turned into months, and Anton's disappearance dissolved into silence. No new reports, no enemy claims of capture, no ransom videos. He didn't show up in drone footage or surveillance intercepts. There was nothing. Just a name marked MIA and a vague unease that settled over the unit like a weight no one wanted to carry. The official stance was straightforward. He was missing in hostile territory during night operations. Unfortunate, but not unusual. Yet inside the ranks, something else began to spread rumors. At first, whispered late at night near the heating units. Then, in tighter circles, behind tent flaps and closed truck doors. Some said Anton had defected, walked into the fog with maps and secrets and never looked back. Others, darker, said it was friendly fire, an accidental strike, a cover-up, that someone panicked in the fog, saw movement, and fired. But that theory never held. No one remembered a shot, no one heard an explosion, he had simply disappeared. In late spring, a small detachment of internal investigators arrived unannounced. No insignias, no small talk. They asked questions with the kind of tone that made you answer carefully. What was the captain's state of mind? Did he express dissatisfaction? Was he religious? Superstitious? They combed through gear logs, re-interviewed the men, remapped the operation. And then they left, offering no conclusion, just a quiet warning not to discuss the matter further. Official morale slipped, unofficial morale plummeted. Some soldiers started sleeping with the lights on. Then, weeks after the investigators had gone, a corporal named Denis Orlov made a passing comment during maintenance duty that froze the blood of everyone within earshot. He said he'd seen something that night just before the strike, just before Anton vanished. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Not moving, not ducking, just watching. "At first I thought it was one of ours," Orlov said, his voice low. "But then the captain looked straight at it, like he knew it was there. And then he followed it." No one asked what it was. Not really. No one wanted to. By the time 2023 rolled around, Anton Lebedev's name had drifted into that quiet, dusty section of military archives where unsolved cases go to sleep. His file, once thick with reports and maps and frantic requests for updates, thinned until only a few sheets remained. The official stance never changed: missing in action during night operations. Unlikely to be alive, no further resources allocated. Unspoken but understood, his case was cold. His family received the same phrase countless others had heard throughout the war. "It is time to move on." Polite, firm, final. His mother signed the acknowledgement form with a shaking hand, her eyes refusing to meet the officers. His sister refused to sign at all. The Army returned what little was recovered from his gear cache. A watch cracked across its face, a compass with a frozen needle, and a field notebook that looked as if it had survived a fire. Half the pages were scorched black, their edges flaking into ash at the slightest touch. The cover was warped, stiff, and smelled faintly of wet earth. Most of the writing was unreadable, ink smeared into oily streaks, sentences swallowed by burn marks. But one line remained intact, written in Anton's compact, measured handwriting. "Some things don't belong to any side." No date, no explanation. Just that single unsettling sentence suspended like a warning. Investigators debated its meaning. Some called it poetic nonsense. Others thought it hinted at desertion or defection. A few simply shrugged. By then, interest in the case had evaporated. The war had moved on, the front lines had shifted, and new disappearances demanded attention. Anton's file was stamped, logged, shelved, never officially closed but no longer truly open either. Unofficially, the matter was over. His photo, the one from officer training where he stood perfectly straight, eyes calm, uniform crisp, was taken down from the active search board and moved to a binder labeled "Mia Presumed Dead." His name faded from briefings. His story stopped circulating among the ranks. But among the men who'd served with him, unease lingered. Because they knew Anton steady, disciplined, unshakable, Anton was not the kind of man who simply vanished. And a burned notebook with one cryptic line felt more like an echo than an ending. The truth didn't resurface until the summer of 2024, long after most had stopped saying his name aloud. In the Luhansk region, where the fighting had quieted into uneasy pockets of stillness, mushroom season drew locals back into forests they'd avoided for years. One of them, a 47-year-old forager named Oleg, wandered off a familiar trail in search of chanterelles after heavy rain. The woods were thick that day, humid, fragrant with pine sap and damp soil. Oleg moved slowly, scanning the ground, listening to the gentle drip of water still falling from the branches. That's when he saw it. At first, just a shape where no shape should be. Something wedged in the crook of a pine tree about 10 feet up, brown, lumpy, motionless. He squinted, thinking it might be a hunter's tarp or abandoned camping gear. But the closer he stepped, the faster his heart began to pound. Because the tarp wasn't wrapped around supplies, it was wrapped around a body. Partially decomposed, mottled, shrunken by exposure yet strangely intact, the legs dangled stiffly, boots cracked and weathered. The hands were drawn inward, fingers curled as if gripping something long since gone. And near the shoulder, half hidden under sap and moss, A fragment of military fabric clung stubbornly to the remains' Russian camouflage, faded but unmistakable. Oleg stumbled back, nearly dropping his basket, then fumbled for his phone. Within hours, police and military personnel swarmed the clearing. They cordoned off the area and brought the body down with grim precision. Forensics teams didn't need long. Even before the dog tags were cleaned of dirt and resin, one of the officers recognized the name, Lebedev Anton Sergeyevich. Captain, missing since winter 2022. They checked twice, then a third time, but the tags were real. The uniform scraps matched, and the face, what little was left, fit the aged photographs. It was impossible. It was undeniable. Captain Anton Lebedev had been found in a tree 2 years after he disappeared into the fog. The tree didn't make sense. Not to the forensics team. Not to the officers who dragged Anton Lebedev's body from its branches. And certainly not to the botanist quietly brought in under the pretext of terrain analysis. The pine stood just under 15 meters tall, native to the region, unremarkable by any local standard. But it wasn't the tree itself that disturbed them, it was what the tree had held. Anton's body had been discovered suspended in a natural crook, where the trunk split into a wide Y just above head height. He hadn't been hanging. He hadn't been tied. He was placed, or worse, positioned. 10 feet up, cocooned loosely, in a brown military tarp now stiff with sap, his body was partially mummified, the skin shriveled but whole, the uniform still clinging to his frame in places. His boots were weathered but intact. His hands, curled inward as if frozen mid-motion, bore no defensive wounds. The medical team expected signs of trauma shrapnel, a bullet wound, broken limbs, something to explain how a trained officer ended up lifeless in a tree. They found nothing. No fractures, no bruising, no punctures. The skin, where it remained, was dry but unbroken. No signs of animal activity either. No scavenger had touched him. That alone was strange. In 2 years, a corpse left exposed in the open should have been scattered by now, picked over, dragged apart. But this wasn't a scattered body. It was preserved. Investigators circled the site in growing unease. The ground showed no scuff marks, no footprints leading to the base, no disturbed soil, no ladder drag, no vehicle tracks. The lower branches were untouched, not one snapped limb, no signs of weight or pressure, as if he'd been placed there without ever passing through the space below. Was there a flood? One officer asked. A landslide? But the terrain hadn't changed. The tree hadn't bent or shifted. The bark bore no claw marks, no rope abrasion. It was like waking up to find someone sitting on your roof without ever hearing them climb. The lead forensic examiner, a captain with 20 years' experience in battlefield recovery, said it quietly, like he hoped no one would hear him. He didn't die here. He was brought here. But by what and how and why, no one could say. The autopsy offered fewer answers than the scene itself, and far more questions. Anton's body, once transported to a military lab outside Rostov, was examined with clinical precision. Specialists expected signs of long-term exposure, sun bleaching, bone degradation, insect damage, weather etching. Instead, they found a body that had been preserved, almost sheltered. His organs were desiccated but present, like he'd died in dry conditions only months earlier. His eyes were gone, collapsed in the sockets, but his teeth were perfect. No signs of decay in the gums, skin like waxed paper stretched over bone. The official cause of death, inconclusive. No blunt force trauma, no internal bleeding, no broken bones, no trace of toxins, venom, or known pathogens. His stomach contained fragments of dried plant matter, inedible, fibrous, unprocessed. The kind of thing a starving man might chew out of desperation. His bloodstream showed no sign of dehydration or infection. His heart had simply stopped. But it was the estimated time of death that froze the room. Based on tissue preservation, blood protein degradation, and internal moisture retention, Anton had not been dead for 2 years. He had died 4 to 6 months prior to discovery, which meant, somehow, impossibly, he had survived for over a year after vanishing, unarmed, unreported, unseen. No medical record could reconcile it. No unit had spotted him. No drone picked him up. No hospital or prison or detainment site logged his name. There were no witnesses, no messages, no trace of life between December 2022 and spring 2024. He had lived in the silence, somewhere. Forensics couldn't explain how his uniform bore no heavy wear, how his boots had no rips despite the terrain, or how his body appeared untouched by the thousands of small deaths that claim lost men in the wild. Some suggested a rogue unit had held him. Others whispered about desert hideouts, separatist enclaves, off-grid survivalists. But nothing lined up. No known group admitted to contact. No rumors of a prisoner matching his description had circulated. He had lived, somehow. And then he had died alone, silently, placed like a relic in a tree no one had reason to look at. One examiner, after finishing the report, asked quietly what others were thinking. If he survived the war, what was he running from? 2 days after the body was recovered, a ground team returned to the site to comb through the surrounding soil and underbrush. That's when they found it wedged beneath a tangle of roots, protected by a thin, waterproof pouch, slick with sap and age. A notebook, standard issue, soft-bound, military green. The cover was smeared with dirt, the edges swollen from moisture, but it had survived. Inside were 27 pages, some blank, others covered in handwriting that shifted between neat and frantic. It was Anton's. His initials were scrawled inside the back cover, along with a date, January 2023. Over a year after he had vanished. The early pages started coherently observations about terrain, entries on weather patterns, crude maps of surrounding forest features. But by the midpoint, things began to unravel, sentences fragmented, words repeated. Whole passages circled back on themselves like the writer was caught in a loop. There were drawings too, sketches of twisted trees, circles formed by what looked like animal bones, and crude human silhouettes with faces blacked out by violent pencil strokes. One phrase appeared multiple times, always in different ink, sometimes scrawled across page margins. The mirrored men. Other entries spoke of whispers under the bark, and a second sky in the canopy that doesn't move with the wind. The descriptions were cryptic, feverish. Shapes watching from behind tree trunks. Days with no sense of time. The idea that something was using the forest to listen. He mentioned dreams or something like them where branches opened like ribs and the ground breathed when I slept. By the final entry, dated only March 2, his handwriting was nearly illegible, shaky, written as if by a hand on the edge of collapse. But one line stood out, underlined twice, in smudged ink. They return when it's quiet. The tree is safer than the ground. Investigators debated whether it was the rambling of starvation, a product of isolation and exposure. But then again, he had lasted over a year. Long enough to write, to think, to choose where to die. The tree hadn't been random. It had been shelter, or escape, or something worse. And whatever he saw out there, the mirrored men, the watchers in the canopy, it was enough to make the ground more terrifying than death above it. The official report would never mention the notebook. It wouldn't mention the position of the body, the absence of trauma, or the forensic anomalies. It would not speak of mirrored men, or forest whispers, or a second sky. By the end of that week, the site was declared restricted under Article 347 of the Defense Secrets Act. Civilian access was blocked, satellite images redacted. The body was transported to a closed military morgue. The forager who found Anton, the quiet man from Luhansk, who just wanted mushrooms, was interviewed 3 times in 5 days. After that, he stopped speaking to neighbors, stopped appearing in town. Some say he moved to Belarus. Others say he didn't move at all. The press never heard a word of it. No article ran, no obituary was printed. The ministry issued a single-sentence statement: Captain Anton S. Lebedev was recovered deceased following an accident during a classified operation. His family was brought in for a private briefing. They were told he had suffered a fatal fall during a reconnaissance mission. No body was presented. Just ashes, sealed in a container marked with an incorrect rank. His mother accepted it without speaking. His sister refused to take the urn. She walked out without a word. Back at Anton's former unit, his name was scrubbed from the memorial wall. The men who'd served with him received quiet visits from military liaisons. They were advised to avoid speculation and to refrain from discussing unresolved events during active duty. One soldier was reassigned. Another left the service within a month. A week later, an intelligence officer conducted an unannounced sweep through the barracks and confiscated a photograph pinned to a locker, one taken the night before Anton vanished. In the background, obscured by fog, was a tree, and beside it, something that wasn't a soldier. Something tall, something wrong. What the government chose to bury wasn't just a body, it was a question. One too complex, too dangerous, or too damning to answer. So they did what governments do. They classified it, filed it, forgot it. And somewhere deep in the forest where no roads reach, the trees still stand, watching, holding what only the dead remember. In the months after Anton Lebedev's discovery, the forest around the site took on a life of its own, at least in the stories whispered by those who lived closest to it. Folklore that had faded decades ago crept back into conversation, spoken quietly in markets and over kitchen tables, as if saying the words too loudly might summon something listening. The elders called them the Hollow Ones, figures that looked human until they turned, revealing empty faces. Forest spirits, omen bearers, creatures that watched from between trees and led hunters astray. Tales, once dismissed as superstition, now resurfaced with unsettling detail. Hunters who vanished for days and returned with no memory of where they'd been. Children who claimed to hear voices coming from tree roots. Old stories of men found in branches as if they'd climbed to escape something on the ground. At first, investigators brushed off the talk as rural paranoia, until villagers from two separate towns, miles apart, came forward with eerily consistent accounts of the night Anton disappeared. They spoke of strange lights flickering above the tree line, blue-white flashes that pulsed like slow lightning but made no sound. Not shelling, not drones, something else. Something that hovered and moved in patterns no aircraft could replicate. Some described long, slender silhouettes crossing the fog too tall to be human, too smooth in motion to be mechanical. Then came the satellite review. Analysts comparing surveillance from December 2022 with recent imagery found something they couldn't explain. A heat bloom, circular, expanding outward from a single point deep inside the forest where no vehicles or artillery units had been deployed. It lasted 7 minutes, then vanished as if someone had shut off a switch. No explosion. No fire. No infrared footprint of fleeing personnel. Just a bright flare of heat in a place that should have been frozen solid. The official conclusion was a data anomaly. But off the record, the analysts said it looked like nothing they had ever seen. The more they studied, the more the patterns emerged. Unclaimed drone footage with blurred figures, thermal readings of shapes that didn't match animals, and a dozen hunter disappearances within a 15-kilometer radius, all in the same year Anton vanished. Whatever Anton encountered in those woods, whatever he wrote about in that journal, had not just taken him, it had left a trail that didn't belong to any army or any war. Something old, something patient. Something that moved through the forest the way mist moved through air, quiet, shapeless, watching. In the end, the file on Captain Anton Sergeyevich Lebedev was closed with the cold efficiency of bureaucratic certainty. His death certificate was stamped, his service number archived, his name added to the long list of Russian war dead. Another casualty of a conflict that swallowed thousands without pause. Officially, his story was over. But among those who had known him, his former officers, the soldiers who'd been there that night, the sister who refused to accept a sealed urn, there was no closure. What lingered instead was the tree. The way it held him long after it should have let him fall, the way his body seemed protected rather than discarded, the way the ground beneath it felt untouched, quiet, almost reverent. Trees don't choose. Trees don't hide bodies. Trees don't preserve men who should have turned to bones years earlier. And yet, the forest around Anton's final resting place felt like it knew something, like it remembered. Rumors grew, slowly but stubbornly. Not the loud conspiracy theories of outsiders, but soft-spoken beliefs held by the ones who had seen the fog swallow Anton whole. They didn't talk about deserters or ambushes or friendly fire. They didn't talk about madness or starvation. They talked about the forest, about the lights, about the mirrored men Anton wrote about with shaking hands. One lieutenant put it simply, late one night, after too much vodka, he didn't die in a war. He died running from something the war woke up. No one argued with him. The final page of Anton's second notebook, the one found beneath the roots, was copied before being locked away. Soldiers passed the sentence quietly among themselves, never daring to say it in front of superiors. They return when it's quiet. The tree is safer than the ground. What had he seen? What had followed him through the woods? Why had the ground become the most dangerous place he knew? No one could answer. The forest didn't speak. The officials didn't listen. And Anton himself had carried the truth into the branches of that pine where only silence could follow. The story ends the way some truths do, abruptly, unresolved, swallowed by the dark between trees. A captain lost, a body recovered, a warning carved into madness, and a belief, whispered by those who were there, that refuses to die. Anton Lebedev wasn't taken by war. He was taken by something that lives between it. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.